There are certain places that seem to absorb tragedy. Buildings where, over time, the walls begin to hold on to something heavier than memories. Places where death becomes so common that eventually, people stop acting surprised. Long before it became infamous online, before documentaries, conspiracy theories, and viral elevator footage, people were already dying inside the Cecil Hotel. And over the course of nearly a century, the building developed a reputation so dark that some believed it had become cursed. But maybe the truth is even more unsettling than that, because the Cecil Hotel wasn't hidden away in the middle of nowhere. It stood in the middle of Los Angeles, visible, ordinary, and for decades, people continued checking in, despite the stories. Tonight, we're exploring the disturbing history of the Cecil Hotel, a place tied to violence, disappearances, serial killers, unexplained deaths, and one mystery that would eventually capture the attention of the entire internet. This is Unsettling Stories. In 1924, the Cecil Hotel opened in downtown Los Angeles. At the time, the area was booming. Developers imagined the hotel as a destination for businessmen, tourists, and travelers looking for luxury in the growing city. The building itself was elegant for its time. Marble lobby, palm trees, ornate decor, a symbol of opportunity. But almost immediately, things began to change. Just 5 years after the hotel opened, the Great Depression devastated the United States, and downtown Los Angeles began to decline. The area surrounding the Cecil slowly transformed into what would eventually become known as Skid Row, riddled with poverty, violence, addiction, and mental illness. The city around the hotel changed, and over time, so did the people staying inside. What was once meant to be glamorous slowly became transient, temporary. People passed through constantly. Some stayed for days, others for months. And eventually, the Cecil Hotel developed a reputation. Not just for crime, but for death. Over the years, the hotel became linked to an unbelievable amount of suicides, overdoses, violent incidents, and unexplained tragedies. And one of the most disturbing parts of this story is how normal it all began to seem. Because after enough time, horror stops shocking people. It just becomes part of the building. Throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, reports of deaths inside the Cecil became disturbingly common. Some guests died by suicide, others overdosed. Some were fully never identified. And while many older buildings accumulate tragedy over time, there was something different about the Cecil. The incidents never seemed to stop. In 1931, a man was found dead after ingesting poison. Not long after, another guest was discovered deceased in his room. Then another, and another. Year after year, reports continued. People jumping from windows, bodies found in rooms, violent altercations, sudden deaths. The hotel became known less as a place to stay and more as a place people disappeared into. And eventually, the atmosphere surrounding the building began to shift. Employees reportedly became desensitized. Police visits became routine. Ambulances arriving outside the hotel no longer drew attention. At some point, the Cecil stopped feeling like a hotel and started feeling like a place people ended up when their lives were already falling apart. That idea is important because over time, the building itself became surrounded by myth. People began asking the same question over and over again. Was the Cecil somehow attracting darkness? Or was it simply located in a part of the city where suffering had become impossible to avoid? And depending on who you ask, the answer changes. One of the hotel's most disturbing early incidents happened in 1962. A woman named Pauline Otten checked into the Cecil with her husband. Witnesses later reported hearing an argument between the couple. Not long after, Pauline either jumped or fell from the window of her 9th floor room. But what makes this story horrifying is what happened next. As she fell, she struck a pedestrian walking outside the hotel. The impact killed both of them. The man she landed on had no connection to the hotel, no connection to her. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And stories like this only deepen the hotel's reputation, because the tragedies connected to the Cecil often felt random and chaotic. Like anyone who stepped too close to the building risked becoming part of its history. And as decades passed, the stories only became darker. By the 1980s, the Cecil Hotel had become notorious. Cheap rooms, long-term residence, minimal oversight, a place where anonymity was easy. And that anonymity attracted dangerous people, including one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker. In 1985, Ramirez was actively murdering people throughout California. His crimes were brutal, terrifying, and incredibly random. During part of his killing spree, he was reportedly staying at the Cecil Hotel. According to multiple accounts, Ramirez would return to the hotel late at night after committing murders, covered in dirt, sometimes covered in blood, and no one stopped him. No one questioned him. Because at the Cecil, strange behavior no longer stood out. That detail alone is incredibly unsettling. Imagine a building so consumed by chaos that one of the most dangerous men in the country could move through it almost unnoticed. But Ramirez wouldn't be the only serial killer connected to the hotel. Years later, another man linked to multiple murders would also stay there. Jack Unterweger, an Austrian writer and convicted murderer. Unterweger had previously been imprisoned for killing a young woman, but while incarcerated, he began writing, and somehow he convinced people he had changed, authors, journalists, and intellectuals alike. Many publicly supported his release, and after being freed, he traveled to Los Angeles, where he chose to stay at the Cecil Hotel. Not long after arriving, several women were murdered. The similarities between the killings eventually pointed investigators back to Unterweger. And once again, the Cecil Hotel found itself connected to another horrifying chapter. At this point, the hotel's reputation had become almost mythological. People no longer spoke about isolated incidents. They spoke about the building itself. Like the Cecil had become something more than just a location, something stained, something wrong. And then came the case that would make Cecil Hotel infamous across the internet. In January of 2013, a 21-year-old Canadian student named Elisa Lam arrived in Los Angeles. She was traveling alone, documenting her trip online, posting photos, writing about her experiences, and at some point during her stay, she checked into the Cecil Hotel. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but days later, Elisa disappeared. Her family stopped hearing from her, and eventually, police began investigating. Then came the elevator footage. Security camera video released by authorities showed Elisa inside one of the hotel elevators, and the footage disturbed people immediately. In the video, Elisa behaves erratically. She presses buttons multiple times, steps in and out of the elevator, looks into the hallway, gestures strangely. At times, it almost appears as though she's speaking to someone who isn't visible. And for years, people debated what the footage actually showed. Fear, paranoia, mental distress, or something else entirely. The video spread rapidly online. Millions of people watched it, analyzed it, and slowed it down, trying to understand what they were seeing. And then the story became even worse. Guests staying at the hotel began complaining about the water. They said it tasted strange, looked dark, and had low pressure. Eventually, maintenance workers investigated the hotel's rooftop water tanks, and inside one of them, they discovered Elisa Lam's body. The internet exploded. Conspiracy theories spread everywhere. People questioned how she reached the roof, how she entered the tank, whether someone else had been involved. Some believed the hotel was haunted. Others believed the footage revealed someone following her. And over time, the case became one of the internet's most infamous mysteries. But beyond the theories, there's something genuinely eerie about the story. Not because it proves anything supernatural, but because the footage captures a moment that feels deeply wrong. A moment people instinctively react to, even without understanding why. And maybe that uncertainty is what made the case so unforgettable. Because humans are uncomfortable with the things that resist explanation. We want answers. We want narratives. But sometimes reality refuses to organize itself cleanly. And the more people tried to explain the Cecil Hotel, the darker its reputation became. After Elisa Lam's death, interest in the Cecil Hotel exploded. People online began digging through decades of incidents connected to the building. Deaths, disappearances, violence, serial killers, suicides, and suddenly, the hotel stopped feeling like a real location. It started to feel like mythology and material for videos, forums, documentaries, Reddit theories, and ghost stories. The internet transformed the Cecil into something larger than reality. And in some ways, that made the building feel even more unsettling. Because once enough stories become attached to a place, perception changes. People stop seeing a hotel. They start seeing a symbol, a physical representation of fear. And eventually, almost every strange event connected to the building became interpreted through that lens. If someone died there, it wasn't just tragic. It became evidence. Proof that something about the Cecil was fundamentally wrong. But there's also another way to look at the story. Maybe the Cecil Hotel wasn't cursed. Maybe it simply stood at the intersection of poverty, violence, addiction, isolation, and human suffering for nearly a century. Maybe the building became infamous because it reflected the darkest part of the city surrounding it. And maybe that explanation is more disturbing than the paranormal one. Because it means the horror wasn't supernatural. It was human. In later years, efforts were made to rebrand the Cecil. Parts of the building were renovated. At one point, sections were even marketed under a different name. But the reputation never disappeared, because some stories become impossible to separate from a place, and eventually the Cecil Hotel closed. But the story of the building didn't end there. In recent years, the property has undergone redevelopment efforts, and portions of the building have been converted into affordable housing intended to support the formerly unhoused. And in a strange way, that final chapter feels deeply connected to the hotel's history. Because beneath the mythology, the internet theories, and the horror surrounding the Cecil, the building had always existed at the center of human struggle. Isolation. People searching for somewhere to stay, somewhere temporary, somewhere affordable. For decades, the Cecil became tied to people who had nowhere else to go. And now, after nearly a century of tragedy and infamy, the building is being used in an attempt to help others rebuild their lives. But even now, people continue talking about it, watching the elevator footage, researching the deaths, looking through old photographs, trying to understand why one building became associated with so much darkness. And maybe there isn't a single answer. Maybe the Cecil Hotel became infamous because it existed at the perfect intersection of tragedy and storytelling. A real place filled with real suffering that slowly transformed into legend. There's something uniquely unsettling about places like the Cecil Hotel, not because they prove the existence of anything paranormal, but because they force us to confront how easily ordinary places can become tied to horror. At the end of the day, the Cecil was just a building. And yet, over time, it became one of the most infamous hotels in the world. Not because of one event, but because tragedy kept returning to it. By the time the Cecil Hotel closed its doors, its reputation had already outlived the building itself. And maybe that's what makes the story linger. The idea that some places don't just hold memories, they absorb fear. If you enjoyed tonight's episode of Unsettling Stories, make sure to subscribe and let me know what disturbing case or mystery you would like to see covered next. And as always, thanks for listening and watching.